Everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second part of our three-part series on mental health. And while the topic that we cover today is a little bit difficult to discuss, we're here to address the pressing issue, which is workplace despair and suicide. So this isn't just about numbers. It's not just about statistics. It's about real lives. And it's about the importance of mental health in our work environments. So today you're going to hear some real stories of loss, but you're also going to hear some stories of survival. You're going to hear some stories that the survivors have told us about what they want us to know after the fact. And so our goal is to explore some of those compassionate strategies that support our colleagues and then also prevent tragedies. So I thank you for your courage to attend today. And I ask that you open up your hearts and that you share and be interactive as you feel led to do so, because that's how we all learn and grow together. So in terms of me, my name is Holly Foxworth. I am a registered nurse and I'm the marketing manager for content here at Axiom. And I'm going to be shortly introducing two of the brightest minds in mental health. They are not only experts, but they're also amazing advocates. So you'll be meeting them shortly. But before we get started, let's get you acquainted with what you're looking at here on your webinar platform, because this is what you'll need to kind of navigate your way throughout the session here. So on the right-hand side of your screen, that's where you'll see there'll be a large box. Some people call it fuchsia color, some people call it red, some call it maroon. I guess it probably just depends on what your computer settings are, but there will be a blue box that's below that says RSVP. So what you'll do is you'll just press that button and that will reserve your seat for our final session. That'll be the third one in our series, and that topic is going to be discussing a topic that relates to all of us, which is anxiety. So not only anxiety, but also techniques for how to manage that. So you definitely don't want to miss that. So again, all you have to do to register for that is press that button, press the RSVP button, and that's going to get you registered. You don't have to enter any additional information, and you'll get your confirmation and get that put on your calendars. So as always, this event will be recorded, and then we will also make a version, an on-demand version available to you within 24 hours is usually when that goes out. We do have a copy of today's slide deck, and so that is located there at the bottom of your screen. There's also some excellent resources that are finally, one of my favorite components of these webinars are gifts. And so those are what I send out after these events for some of the fantastic questions and comments and stories that you guys share. And the way that you do that is by putting that in that Q&A chat box there at the bottom of your screen. So we read every single thing that you put in there. And it's the first place that I go whenever I go to look to personally reach out to several individuals that have sent some very interesting stories and some amazing questions. And then the last way that you can interact with us is by using the emojis, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So you can do those thumbs ups, you can do the hearts, and what that does is it basically tells us what parts of the webinar were most meaningful to you. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get our presenters introduced. We'll start with Dr. Curtay, and then we'll follow with Sarah. Dr. Curtay?
Thanks, Holly, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'm Dr. Les Curtay, Senior VP for Behavioral Health at Axiom Medical. I have, my children tell me I've been in clinical practice since before the Earth's crust was fully cooled. I have a lot of clinical experience. I've spent the last 25 years really of my career focused on workplace mental health. So that's the area that I bring to this, both clinical experience and understanding work and how mental health plays in the workspace.
Fantastic. Well, we're so grateful to have you here. Sarah?
Hi, thank you, Holly. I am Sarah Hathaway. I am the Director of Behavioral Health and Absence Management here at Axiom. I'm a licensed clinical social worker out of Michigan, and for about a decade, I've been focusing on workplace mental health, primarily around critical incidents, workers' compensation, disability, mental health issues, and look forward to talking about this very important topic today.
Well, Sarah, We're thrilled to have you as well. Well, to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to go through today is the first thing that we're going to talk about is the faces of despair and suicide. And so we have some stories that go along with that. Then we'll go through the impacts of suicide. We're going to go through some common misconceptions because we know that there's a lot of those that exist. We're going to look at how it is that you can recognize signs that someone may be at risk of death by suicide. We want you to know also share what some topics and some statements that have been made by some of the survivors about what they want us to know. And then we will wrap that up with a brief review of mental health first aid so that you know and you're prepared in the event that you were to be faced with one of these types of scenarios. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Les Curtay, and you have some interesting stories that I hope that you'll share with our group.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this as I looked at this slide again, and I think this is kind of the perfect slide because we could have put any faces up here. Part of what we need to understand about suicide is you don't see it on somebody's face. You can't tell just by looking at somebody what's going on inside. I mean, that's one of the things that's true of us as people. Holly asked me to tell a story of, my very best friend this month, 13 years ago now, I got a phone call. I was just remembering this morning. I was bowling with my two youngest, and I got a phone call from another friend of ours that my friend Tom had died by suicide. And it was just, you can imagine, kind of the shock. To give you a sense of this, he is someone who we worked together for 9 years at a large insurance carrier. We had virtually every morning that we were both in town, we had breakfast together. So I knew he could get into some pretty dark places. We both left there. He was 2 weeks away from starting a new job. He was 2 weeks post having both of his cataracts repaired or replaced. Who dies by suicide and then, but 2 weeks before gets their cataracts done? It was just one of those things. The thing that's most striking about this story for me is, I had all the reactions that I think everyone has who's been touched by suicide. It's a lot of the people on this call, I can guarantee. I was shocked, I was sad, I was angry. Mostly what I realized is, there were probably a half a dozen of us who were friends. We could have been and would have been on his doorstep in less than 10 minutes had we known. Mm-hmm. And so part of my anger originally was, well, why didn't he call? And I realized, and I think the biggest message of this is he couldn't call. If he had been able to call, he would probably still be alive. And it wouldn't have been because it was anything that I or any of those other friends did. It was because he would not have gotten to that point of despair that he was still able to reach out for help. And we're going to talk some today about, how important it is to be able to speak directly to someone about thoughts about suicide, about plans about suicide. And I think that's what we have to know. There's one of the myths we'll also talk about is, if people are talking about it, they're not going to do it. Neither of those things are true. It's really important to be able to talk with someone specifically. Because when they get to that last stage, they're not able to do it anymore. And so I think for me, that's the story. one last thought is that, for those of you who have been touched by death by suicide, somewhere in your family or friends, it doesn't go away. I mean, I think about Tom a lot, and um, it doesn't go away, and that's okay. We learn to cope with things with losses, but you don't have to force yourself to push it out of mind.
Mm-hmm. Good
I'll
point.
leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, she brought up used the term when you said, angry. And I was going to ask you about, what were your feelings? How did you process that? What did grief look like for you?
Well, it was all of those things. I mean, I remember being at his memorial, visit with the family, had a service, and the moment that got me was when I saw his casket, which was closed, but on top of it was like I don't know if it was his wife or his kids had made a tree of different fishing lures, and there was a specific fly that he bought when we were on a fishing trip that I recognized.
Wow.
And I just burst into tears.
I bet.
It was like reminders would bring the sadness. The anger really was, why? I mean, I said, and I don't mean this flippantly at all. I mean, I remember saying to another friend of ours, if I could, I'd dig him up and kill him again. I was that mad at him. And I think that's pretty common. And of course, there's this survivor guilt. Like, well, why him? Why should he not be alive and I am? Other thing that was interesting is that people were generating all kinds of theories about why he did it, and they infuriated me, because they were all making stuff up. And what I finally did when I got over my anger was the moment when I said, you know what? I don't care why he did it. There's no reason, there's no explanation that is going to be good enough for me to make up for that loss. And that was the point at which I was able to let go of the anger. It's like, I just miss him. But it took a while to get there.
I bet it did. William had wrote in and said, I'm in construction. Macho construction workers fight the stigma of speaking up. How do we help people who need help that feel like that they cannot tell anyone?
Well, we will talk more about this as we go through this hour, but the biggest thing is being present. If everyone on this call thinks about it for a minute, like, what do you need when you are distressed about anything? When you have a problem, you have a medical problem, you go into your doctor. I ask that question in a lot of different settings when I'm doing presentations, and inevitably, what it comes down to is we want to be heard. Being heard involves, for you to feel heard by me, that involves me being in the room with you and neither running away, making a joke, making distance, literally running away. Those are all ways of withdrawing from someone's pain, nor trying to fix it. You can't necessarily fix it. I think what works is being present with people, and we will talk about some specifics about how you can talk to somebody about that. it is. I mean, there's a huge amount of stigma about it, about mental health in general, and certainly about thinking about suicide. But it's really about being present and not being afraid to talk to someone.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Susanna had also wrote in here, there was 2 comments about anger. Susanna had said, when my ex-husband, let's see, I'm sorry, my thing lost, there it is. When my ex-husband did it, I was very angry. I felt like his acts were very selfish and he didn't think of our children and their lives. And I still have a lot of resentment towards him. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Like, very valid. Yeah.
I think those feelings are, I think they're natural. They're certainly common. You know, I think we'll talk more about that as well as we go through the hour.
Absolutely. Sarah, talk to us about the impact of suicide.
Yeah, I saw the comment here about why be mad if someone you care for dies by suicide, because only the person who did it knows what led them there. And I think that's an important point to acknowledge. Anger and our initial emotional reactions in situations like this are not rational, right? When we go through incredibly difficult experiences, we're looking at the why and the what if. What if we could have done something differently? What if circumstances had been different? Why did it happen? And so a lot of those initial reactions are just trying to find something that makes sense, because if it makes sense, then we can figure out how to control it and prevent it. But oftentimes it's not. Suicide isn't a rational decision because people have become so desperate that rational thought isn't something that comes easily at that point. Same thing for those who have just lost someone to suicide. So I think when we're talking about impact, that's a really important thing to understand, is just how we get affected so much. We're not necessarily thinking about things logically. But this is something that is incredibly widespread. And again, most people have been touched by suicide in some way. Just to acknowledge some of the data around the prevalence, suicide risk has been rising for over 20 years now. From the year 2000 to 2022, it's been a 69% increase, from around 30,000 to nearly 50,000 suicide deaths per year. 2022 was a record high for suicide deaths, and even preliminary data from 2023 shows that those suicide rates have just continued to increase. So this is a problem that is not going away. In fact, it's worsening quite a bit. Every 10 minutes, someone dies by suicide. And if you think about that in the course of your day, how often this is happening, it's really really astounding to recognize that throughout our day that's happening all over the country and all over the world. But it's something where resources are difficult to come by. It's something, there's a lot of stigma around mental health issues, and especially around suicide. So as Dr. Gertay referenced, it's not something that's easy for someone to talk about if they are having suicidal thoughts. It's also not easy to raise the conversation if you're concerned about someone. There are so many things that get in the way. So we really have to acknowledge that this is something that is really requires a lot of attention and increased resources, increased access to mental health services, both in the availability of the services, the cost of those things, and just general awareness and education around all mental health issues, including suicide.
Sarah, you brought up the point about people not wanting to say things. And Mary had said, one of my peers, the operations manager, committed suicide almost 2 years ago. And as an HR person, we spent a lot of time together and I didn't see it. said, I think of him often, and I remember the day, I remember him often, and I remember the day that I saw him, and he was going to work, and it said, let's see, he walked away, he hesitated, then he kept on walking, and I always think that he wanted to say something and changed his mind. After the fact, I learned that he left a lot of clues for his family, and they didn't recognize it. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about those warning signs here soon. But, that is something that's always a challenge, is sometimes those warning signs are very subtle. Sometimes we're not close enough to the person to see them, or sometimes we just don't have the awareness of what those warning signs are. And so that's, again, where that education piece becomes really critical.
Absolutely. One last question that had came in as well was, there was a question of, do we think that that the increased risk of increased use of social media has had a correlation in the increased number of suicide rates?
I don't know. I don't know, Dr. Kate, if you've seen any updates in research. I know I've seen research. I haven't seen anything very conclusive on that, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, we can speculate. Certainly, we can speculate about it. I mean, as my wife likes to say, nobody puts up a terrible picture of themselves on Facebook, right?
Very true.
We present our best selves, and so it kind of, I think it paints an illusory world sometimes, but it's really hard to tell. And the fact of the matter is, we'll never know. These things are, and it's important also to think about these statistics in a way, like a 69% increase in the rate is a lot, but the rate is actually, if you compare it to the population of the US, the rate of completed suicides, people who actually die by suicide, is quite small. On the other hand, 12.2 million people that's 4 out of every 10 people have serious thoughts about suicide. That's 4%. I'm sorry, 4 out of every 100, right? So 100 people, everybody knows 100 people. 4 of those people have had serious thoughts in that last year.
Wow.
This is not a small problem. It's hard to know. I think it's really hard to know what's driving the increase.
And I think just, there are positives and negatives about social media when it comes to suicide. There are negative influences. Again, when someone is in a really deep, dark place and they're seeing everybody else's life seem so perfect, it can feel really, lonely and isolating to be in that situation. I also know personally, I had an old friend I hadn't talked to in many years who posted something incredibly concerning on their social media. And it became a wonderful opportunity for me to reconnect and be supportive to that person who was considering suicide. So I think just as with any other societal change that happens, there are positives and negatives. And as Dr. Kate said, I don't know that we'll know entirely whether it has a correlation, or at the very least, even more so, causation.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about some of the misconceptions. Dr. Curte, you say this better than anyone I've ever heard say it before.
Well, yeah, I think that, I learned this, back to my kids, talking about how long I've been in clinical practice. I learned this a very, very long time ago, like really early in my career. This notion that, suicide's not a problem, it's a solution to a set of problems. And that set of problems typically involves 3 things. Somebody's in a lot of pain, they're exhausted, and they feel helpless. And, suicide looks like, when you're really desperate, suicide looks like a solution to all 3 of those. It's a definitive step I can take. my pain will end, and I will get rest. And the reason that was important to me as a clinician was that I could have that conversation with somebody and say, let's talk about the problems. And, I can't argue with you. It solves all those problems. Problem is, you only get to do it once. So let's see if there's something else we could try to chip away at those problems. And that leads to another thing. I mean, this is one of the myths, and something to keep in mind is that it's typically not ongoing. This is a passing impulse. And if someone stays alive long enough to have a chance at it, chances are pretty good that they won't complete a suicide. I mean, it's not 100%, but when we look at people where there's been an intervention, people who are on the verge and there's been an intervention, often those people do not, in fact, go on to attempt again or complete a suicide. So this is really about getting somebody through a crisis. And that crisis involves them being in a lot of pain, which is why being there for somebody is really so important.
So true. Very, very true. Sarah, talk us through what some of the warning signs would be that we would be looking for.
Yeah. There are many, many warning signs. And so I think the first thing of all of these that I really want to highlight is the behavior change. When significant changes in behavior occur, that's always something to pay attention to in any circumstance. And sometimes it's positive change, sometimes it's not. But change in behavior or patterns of change are what we're really looking for. But if you hear someone who seems really preoccupied with death or preoccupied with the problems in their life and feeling helpless or hopeless about those things improving, those are really concerning behaviors in particular. Other changes, individuals may isolate themselves, withdraw from social activities, not maybe be as present even if they are participating in those activities. And some of those other kind of influential changes are things like changes in mood. If the mood is changing, and again, this can be positive or negative. We see mood swings where it leads toward more negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, but we can also see it in the positive sometimes, especially if it's tied to mania, or if it's tied to someone having identified that they are going to go ahead with their plan for suicide, because oftentimes at that point there's this sense of relief and calm that I'm going to go through with this, and I'm no longer going to be in pain anymore. Some of those preparatory behaviors that we often see as well, once someone has made that decision, are really preparing for that death. So it could be tying up loose ends. Oftentimes it could be anything from creating a will to giving their things away, or, hey, could you, if something happens, could you keep an eye on my dog? Or do you want to take my dog? It can be things even like that. So if you see that someone is saying they no longer have a use for many of their things in their home, or they are looking for others to kind of take on responsibilities that they currently have, those are really big indicators. Any significant changes as well in routine are important to pay attention to. And as mentioned before, any history of suicide attempts, that's one of the biggest predictors of suicide, is past suicide attempts. So anyone who has attempted in the past, especially if you're noticing any of these warning signs, it's a really good indicator that there's something more going on. Now, what I do want to highlight here is that this doesn't necessarily mean that because somebody drafts a will or because somebody has changes in their mood that they are suicidal. So no single thing alone here is going to be a one clear indicator. So we're really looking at all of the information in totality. But I think what's important, especially when we're talking about workplace, to recognize is that it doesn't always look the same with coworkers, and especially for individuals who are working remotely, we don't necessarily have quite as much insight into the behaviors and feelings of our coworkers. So some of the things that you'll pay attention for in the workplace are things like decreased productivity. So really decreased work performance, challenges with concentrating. If somebody's generally a really reliable worker, but suddenly they're missing deadlines or not paying attention in meetings or conversations, if this isn't their typical behavior, that's an important shift. They might also withdraw from work activities. So pulling out of projects with their teammates, skipping meetings, or if they generally are involved in social events, and they suddenly stop coming, it's an important time to check in. If you notice them spending a lot more time alone as well, taking lunch breaks alone when they would usually go with a group, all of that's really important. Additionally, increased absenteeism. If people are, if you have a coworker who's frequently calling into work all of a sudden, and they're not, or they're showing up, but they're not really there, not really working and participating. All of these things are indicators that something more is going on. Again, not necessarily saying that they're suicidal with any of this, but we're looking at it in that totality. You might notice physical changes in grooming, weight loss, weight gain, fatigue. Again, those things like talking about suicide or death, all of those are important. On the HR side, if somebody pulls out of employee benefits all of a sudden, cashes out their retirement plan, those are, again, other things that you might see as risks in that time. You might also see some additional risk-taking behavior, either in their work or personal lives, increasing, they're maybe not necessarily maybe taking more chances, I suppose, with their work quality, or even taking chances in their own lives. So gambling, driving recklessly, things of that nature. So all of those are really important to look for too.
Absolutely. Sarah, I was going to ask you about the expressing the feelings of entrapment or hopelessness. What types of things might you hear someone say, especially within the workplace, where they could be experiencing some of those symptoms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think oftentimes it can be a couple of things. One, it could just be I'm failing here. I can't do this job. I'm going to get fired. I can't get my job done. I'm not doing well enough. So sometimes it's that internal negativity. It also could be more so focused on the organization as a whole. This place is a sinking ship. It's never going to get any better. Looking at everything as just negative, and that there's no room for improvement in any of those areas.
Absolutely. There's some really good questions about what to ask, and we're going to cover those whenever we get to the section about how it is that you can make a difference in going through some of the mental health first aid. So I see your questions there, and I promise that we're going to answer those. The next section I wanted to get to was Dr. Les, talk us through about what to know from those that have survived a suicide attempt. What are some statements that they've told us?
Well, I mean, you can see them on the slide here, I think, and it goes to what I said about, this is typically a temporary state.
Yeah.
It's rare. I mean, I have heard people who were found, who had taken an overdose, who were found, and their initial response was, I wish they would have just let me die. Wow. But that's the exception rather than the rule, right? I mean, I'm not going to say that it never happens, but most of the time people are relieved, so, yeah, sometimes I don't think anyone would notice that I was gone, and but it's in, people may say that in retrospect, and I wish that somebody would have asked me. I
Yeah.
saw one of the questions, what can you like? Actually, one of the comments that I noticed go by was, we don't know what demons people are battling. It's
Yeah.
important to check in on everybody, and I love that comment.
I do too.
You guys have both heard me, and maybe some people in the audience have heard me say, four most important words that I know are "How are you doing?"
Mhm.
But the thing is that you got to ask that question like you mean it, like you're really interested in the answer, not "How you doing?" To which the answer is always fine. I over and over again, we hear from people that, it's important not to be afraid to use the word suicide. Euphemisms are not helpful. When someone is really seriously contemplating ending their life, it's not a time to talk about, are you thinking about doing something bad to yourself? It's like, are you thinking about suicide? It's okay to use that word. I think a lot of people, and we had a question about this, I think a lot of people are afraid of jeopardizing their career. We had a really important case that happened at Axiom where that happened. Somebody wasn't saying, and they were afraid, and it turned out that the intervention, not only stopped that person at the time, but this is what, they realized that maybe there's something more I want to do.
Yeah.
So I think what we hear about is, actually, let me take 1 minute to talk about I have tunnel vision. If anybody on the call has ever felt depressed, you wake up in the morning and you're just having one of those days, especially if it's a few days in a row where, you're just really struggling. Part of that state of mind is the automatic thought that it's always been like this and it's never going to change. That is part of that mindset. And so that tunnel vision thing is real. And it's just a natural response, and you may have noticed for yourself, and then you kind of snap out of it, or something happens, or you get some help, or, you talk to somebody and you feel better, and you're like, well, I don't know, why did I ever think like that? Right. But when you're in it, that's the way that we tend to think. And I use these examples sometimes because I think a lot of what happens around suicide happens to all of us in different contexts, but in very small ways. And we can relate to the feelings if we think about it, even though we may not have had, the thought to kill ourselves. So I think that it's useful to have that level of empathy to think, okay, I could see how that might happen.
Dr. Liz, talk to us about the part about just quietly sitting with someone, even if you don't know what to say, just being there.
Well, I think that is, well, I mentioned it before. I don't want to run away, and I don't want to jump in and fix it necessarily. I want to leave space for that person. I've actually seen this as a Winnie the Pooh cartoon, about Piglet just sitting there, kind of keeping keeping another character happy. I don't remember the details, but you know, just being there, like I don't have to say anything. I'm just going to be here. That's really, really comforting.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you that it takes a lot, like to not speak in that moment. You know, it's like, because you're just leaving that room for somebody who's having a really hard time to say it. And you've asked the question, you've let them know that you're there. So just be there. It's okay.
Absolutely.
Right. And if I really can't think, you know, if I'm just dying to say something, I can't stand it. Saying, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. Right? That's an okay thing to do. Right? I don't know what to say. You know, when someone else has had a terrible loss, you know, it's okay to say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. So.
There was a really impactful comment that had came in that said that I was very angry when I realized that I failed at suicide. But 11 months later, I recommitted my life to Christ. And 3 months after that, I met my husband, my second marriage, and my life changed. That was nearly 17 years ago. And that level of depression is a horrible, dark pit that no one thinks that they will ever recover from.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. Let's talk about how we can make a difference. Let's talk about mental health first aid, and then I want to get to some of these additional questions that are here.
Sure. Well, I mean, we are big fans of mental health first aid. Both Sarah and I have been trainers, and it is a means, it's a way of helping people learn how to think about it, about communicating with somebody who might be in a crisis, how to, and it make us less afraid. You know, you've heard me say this, that it's, for me, the biggest thing that mental health first aid does is, you know, you ask somebody how they're doing and you expect the word fine back. And when somebody says, you know what, I'm not doing very well, instead, everybody panics. Right? I mean, I have a lot of years of clinical experience. I panic. You know, clinicians have that moment of, oh, I wasn't expecting that. Like, now what do I do? And I think what mental health first aid does as a training is it helps you know what to do instead. That it's okay to have that moment of panic and then just talk to people. And you know, and these are the steps. I've been around mental health first aid since shortly after it came to the US in 2009. And I can't say enough about it as a training to help people feel more comfortable in just asking, how are you doing? You know, are you thinking about suicide? So, you know, and this ALGE model is part of mental health first aid. A, for approach and assess, listen non-judgmentally, give reassurance, and encourage either professional help or self-help, or both. It's not a linear process. It's just it's a way of keeping something in your head. And I think the two most important of these are the first two.
Yeah.
You know, you got to approach somebody, and then you have to be able to listen without judgment, which is not easy. But it can be a part of helping to build more resilience in workforces. You know, who do you spend the most time with is people you work with, frankly. And, you know, it's important to know what resources are available to people. There are workplace behavioral health programs. You know, it's why I came to Axiom, to help design that program. But I think that creating a culture in which it's okay for employees to check on one another can make a huge difference. And that's I would say if I've learned anything about workplace mental health, it's that it's really about creating that culture. It's not about a certain program. It's not about, having 8 EAP sessions instead of 5. It's about creating a culture in which you can have that conversation and it's okay. And Sarah, you can say a lot about mental health first aid as well. I kind of jumped into that.
I would just reiterate how the workplace culture of talking about mental health is so critical. And we see, and I know there was that comment about the macho construction industry and macho construction workers. And that's true for many industries in general, where talking about mental health isn't normalized. I think actually the construction industry many companies in the construction industry have done a wonderful job of bringing the conversation about mental health and suicide into the workplace. But for those where it's not normalized, we see it on our end oftentimes where for some, fluke reason, we end up talking to somebody and then find out that they are or have recently been suicidal. And it could be a cut to the finger, a sprained ankle. Part of our program is to ask questions around mental health when employees have been injured on the job. And oftentimes the ones where we identify as a suicide risk is because of some very basic injury on the job. But nobody's asking somebody who cut their finger about their mental health, right? In most situations. So we've shifted that. And I think the other thing, where there tends to be that hesitation is, well, when do I ask about suicide? And my opinion is anytime you're wondering if you should.
Good point.
I talked to someone a while back who wanted to talk to a mental health professional and couldn't explain to me one single reason why. And really just kind of beat around the bush in the conversation, not answering any questions directly. And I had no idea what the concern was, just that they wanted to talk to me. And finally I said, I don't know, and I apologize if I'm going in the wrong direction here, but I would regret it if I didn't ask. Are you calling because you're thinking about suicide? And yes, absolutely, that was what it was. So again, you might be way off base, and that's okay. I think the other fear is I'm going to offend somebody if I ask them. And to that, I say I would much rather offend someone than not ask the question when I should. Because I can apologize left and right after I've offended somebody for asking, but I can't apologize if I've missed the opportunity, right?
Sure.
So I think that just getting comfortable, one, saying the word suicide, and two, bringing it into those conversations if you do have that concern, are just so important in being able to have that impact on people.
Yeah. I think, I used to say this, that, I've never had anyone ever, nor have I ever heard of someone, if you ask them about suicide, say, no, but what a great idea. Like, we are not, we have, but we worry about that. We worry that we're going to put it in somebody's mind. My experience has been that if I ask somebody who's not thinking about it, they just kind of look at me the way that your dog looks at you when you've done something really weird. Like, no, why would you ask that? It's not even being offended. It's just like, no, like, why would you ask that question? It's not you're not putting something in somebody's mind, and typically don't offend somebody. And if you're right, it's a huge relief, because now we can have the conversation because you broached it. Right?
We do have quite a few questions that came in. One, Dan was asking if you know what gives mental health first aid an advantage, in your opinion, over QPR. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, it's question, persuade, refer. It's a suicide prevention training. I'm not as familiar with it. The it's well tailored, I think, to suicide prevention specifically. I think mental health first aid kind of takes a little bit broader approach than only about it. I wish they hadn't used the word persuade.
Right.
Because I think of it differently. I think that I don't want somebody to complete a suicide.
Yeah.
But it's also not my job to talk them out of it. It's my job to listen to them and help them get to a resource. Right. So, but that's just me. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with it as a training or that it's terrible. I just, there are some differences, and it just that language thing just kind of personally annoys me, but it's not, that's me.
Yeah. Lee was asking, for those of us who try to help, but it didn't work and the person completed suicide, any advice for where to put the guilt?
Wow.
Great question. And I feel for anybody who's been in that situation. It's incredibly difficult to put so much effort into trying to help someone and realizing that they were in such despair that you couldn't. I can't say anything to, help dissuade or put away that guilt. But I think that focusing on the fact that you were there to help is really important, and that being in that helping position is really critical for people who are really struggling with suicidal thoughts. And unfortunately, sometimes we can do everything right and we can be there for a person, and things still go wrong. There are still other factors at play. But even with those negative outcomes, it's still important for us to keep doing what we're doing.
I think, just to underline that, I think it's important to remember that it's their choice ultimately. I can't stop them. I did hear something a long time ago that has really stuck with me and that I've used a lot. I think with guilt or any kind of pain, our impulse is to push it away or make it smaller. And I think that the answer to that question really is, you can't make it smaller. You can make yourself bigger. You can you can give yourself space to hold that guilt, and as best you can, learn from it, and you carry it. You can't fix it. It will dull with time. But it's tough. That's a hard thing.
Absolutely. There was another comment that came in that said, I've been thinking about suicide and keep saying that I wouldn't probably follow through. I guess I'm disappointed and seem concerned about this, and the feeling that no one cares enough comes to mind. What resources would you recommend?
Wow.
First of all, this is why we're having this conversation. And I just want to say I'm glad that you're here to hear this. And as far as resources, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a wonderful resource. When I saw that last part of the statement, that feeling that no one cares, that you're not alone in that feeling. And I think probably most of us could relate to that feeling at one point or another, whether we've had suicidal thoughts or not. But the difficult thing about depression and suicidal thinking is that sometimes it tells us really negative things that aren't necessarily accurate. And it's hard to sometimes know what the truth is in those moments. So talking to somebody, again, calling the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or getting connected with a therapist where you can start to sort through those can really make a big difference.
Sarah, will you remind us again that number, the National Suicide Prevention number, of what number to call?
So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline has been wonderful in increasing access. And so they now have a shortened number, so just 988. There's also a crisis text line. I'm just going to confirm that I get the numbers in the right order. 741-741.
Okay.
I think one thing to add to that, really putting a question about, thinking about it, and I probably wouldn't do it. I think the thing to think about, perhaps the place to start, is what are the things that are keeping you from doing it, and focus on those things, grow those things.
Yes.
That's the general piece that I would add to that. But it's okay to get help.
Absolutely. And we can reach out to you as well. Yeah. Next question. Would a crisis assessment team be a good resource to reach out to?
Yes, if there is one in your area. My answer to that is yes. I mean, honestly, that's my go-to response. We have a crisis team here in town, and for this county. And if I have someone that I'm talking to who is contemplating suicide, they are the people I will call, because this is what they do. And where that's a resource, absolutely. Use that resource, and stay with that person while you're waiting. Like I think those two things in combination are really a great resource.
Josh, I wanted to ask one other question that brought up something, and I assume that it's related just to potentially suicide as well. But how can you tell if someone has bipolar disorder?
How can you tell if someone has it, or how can you tell how can you see the signs of suicide if someone has the latter of those two things?
Yes.
I think it's I will say that bipolar disorder is the condition that has the highest rate. And I think that's because that change from a manic high to a deep depression is so profound. But I would be looking for the same signs. I mean, there's nothing really unique about that. And, if I've had someone who is bipolar, who's been through a very severe depressive episode, and then all of a sudden they start to get manic, I actually worry about them in that moment more than any other time, because now they have energy.
Absolutely.
And so I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be really on top of that with them. But again, I want everybody in here to realize that, I'm saying some of these things, and Sarah's saying some of these things, because we are therapists. You may or may not be. If you're listening to this, you're probably not. And so the thing is, how do you help identify somebody help them as much as you can by reaching out and then get them to resources.
Absolutely. One last question here. I know that we're at time, but Jerry was asking, as breaking the stigma around suicide is critical for creating a more supportive and understanding society, how do you encourage open and non-judgmental conversation in the workplace at a company that never feels like they're ready to talk about it? As a suicide attempt survivor myself, this is really important to me, and I feel unheard.
Wow. You do whatever you can to keep talking about it. I mean, it's all I can, there's a really interesting thing it's been in the background through today that, part of it has been that we've changed our language specifically to talk about death by suicide rather than committing suicide, because that phrase tends to imply that somebody's done something wrong. Right. And so we've changed that language, and that's part of it. So it's a tough question. I mean, I don't have a simple answer to that one, but it is exactly what both Sarah and I said. It's about changing the culture.
Absolutely.
And you are a part of that culture. So if you can't change those in charge, you can at least be a role model for having those conversations, those non-judgmental conversations in the workplace, and helping create a culture, even if it's in your own small space, where you can have that impact.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Companies don't have culture. The people who make up a company have culture. I think we forget that sometimes. I know I do.
Very true. Yeah. Well, everyone, thank you so much for being so honest and sharing your stories. And they're so impactful. We appreciate it so much. We're going to be reaching out to many of you. As I mentioned before, the next event that we have about anxiety is coming up. That one will be on June the 6th. And so we look forward to having you there. Thank you again for coming, and we hope you have a great day.